This is a kind of a combination of Lambeth Green Party's monthly meeting and a little bit of extra kind of reaching out to anyone else who's interested really in what's going on with the Greens, and particularly with the Greens' vision for housing. So we've got Sian here tonight. I'll introduce her in a moment, just give you a quick overview of what's going to happen. Sian will go first. She'll talk to us about Green vision for housing in London. There'll be a chance to do some questions and answers and a little bit of discussion and debate amongst us. And then Jonathan Bartley, who's over in the corner there, is going to tell us a bit more about what's happening in the local elections campaign here in Lambeth. And then there'll be a chance to just sign up to help with different things, to chat, ask questions, a bit more of an informal thing. You can get some more food and drink and that sort of stuff. And then we should finish probably that bit of the whole evening by about 9ish or so, maybe 9:30, and then there's a little bit of business that Lambeth Green Party members need to do, which we'll do kind of 9:30 or a little bit earlier if we finish earlier. So, but everybody is very welcome to stay and have more food and drink and support the Brixton Pound Cafe, which is a wonderful institution. And it's great to host us. Okay, so huge pleasure to welcome Sian Berry here. She's a Camden councillor. She's one of 2 Green Party London Assembly members. She chairs the Housing Committee. She's deputy chair of the Policing to Crime Committee. And Lambeth loves Sian. I think 37% of Lambeth voters put Sian first or second preference in the mayoral elections in 2016.
That was the most across the
so you know you're on very friendly territory when you're here. And in some wards it was even higher than that. So some wards not very far from here actually. So so we know Sian is very popular in Lambeth, and we were very, very keen to hear all you can tell us about what you think we should be doing about housing in London. Thank you very much.
Yes, as mentioned, it's very nice to be somewhere that I'm more popular than Camden, actually. We've got the elections coming up, so I'm very nervous about my popularity in Camden at the moment. But yeah, and in the Assembly, I'm chair of the Housing Committee, and I also lead on housing stuff for the Greens. And there's an awful lot going on at the moment in housing at a London level, a lot of which has huge relevance to what's going on at a council level. So what I thought I would talk to you about is some of the changes we've managed to get at a London level, how that has implications locally, and some ideas that are in this thing. See, my printer's broken at home, so I couldn't print out a summary, so I just brought the whole thing. This is the London plan, which is in draft now, and there's quite a lot in there that potentially you could use at a local level to put forward some quite radical policies for the council. I know that sounds a bit weird because it's been written by Sadiq Khan, but it has been influenced by us. This is our document that we sent to him last year. It's called Towards the London Plan. This is our ideas for things he should put in. And then I've been through the housing section and sort of ticked and crossed all the different things he's put in, and there's quite a lot of ticks. You know, there's crosses too, but there's quite a lot of bits where actually, yeah, they put in policies in the London Plan, and it's only a draft, it's not planning policy yet. But these are things on which you can sort of turn around at a council level and say, look, I'll take that London Plan policy, and in Lambeth we have this evidence that shows that we really need this policy to be even stronger in our area, and so our council policy will be this. And I think there's a few things I'll go through on that. But I want to start with estates, because I think for a long time Greens have been the only people really sticking up for people on estates across London. You've got a lot of Tory councils and a lot of Labour councils who are trying to demolish estates, and we're using all kinds of sophistry and smoke and mirrors to make out that this was the best thing. It's going to lead to loads and loads of new council homes, and that everybody loved their plans. And we are hearing from people all over London that that is not the case. And the problem we had was both the major parties had councils in this game, and they weren't sticking up for people, and they were all pretending that it was fine. And so a massive grassroots campaign grew up around the Mayor's draft guidance for estates, and this is something that during the election campaign he felt compelled to say that residents would only have demolition if they supported it. And then everyone sort of took that to mean that the Mayor was promising ballots when he was being elected, ballots for residents, a clear permission, numbers of people who support it, a clear majority of people supporting it would mean that you could do demolition and you wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And then his draft estate guidance came out last December, and it was absolutely useless. It was incredibly useless. It said all kinds of like random bits and pieces of stuff you could do, but it didn't actually say what was required. It didn't say if you didn't comply with the guidance then you wouldn't get the Mayor's funding, which is the main lever he has for making councils do what he wants. And on ballots, it actually cautioned against them. It said something like they represent a binary choice at a single moment in time. And if you're talking about whether or not to demolish something, that is a binary choice, you know, and the residents absolutely, you know, from his manifesto, from what he said during the campaign, could absolutely expect to get a ballot, and he really let them down. So there was a huge campaign right across London, lots of people getting together, public meetings. The campaigners Demolition Watch put together a really good postcard campaign and responded to the draft, the consultation draft, in their thousands. And the really funny thing is, I've got the consultation report here, and in it, it says, it's under miscellaneous because there was no question in the consultation that said, do you want ballots? It was all, you know, is this fine? Under miscellaneous, it said a very high proportion of people who responded to the consultation asked for binding ballots. And the numbers that responded out of 2,000 was like 1,973. That's 95% of people responding to the consultation spontaneously said they want a ballot. So that was pretty clear, and we didn't know that until the final guidance just came out. We've been pestering him for ages to see the responses to the consultation, and all the way through the summer he kept saying, no, it's coming out soon, we won't give you the results, we can't tell you what people said because it's coming out soon, and by December we're like, soon? When is that exactly? And obviously during all this period the political situation changed quite a lot as well. We had the Haringey campaign. It was actually a branch of Haringey Labour who took a motion to the Labour Party conference who said that residents should get ballots. This was passed by Labour Party conference. Jeremy Corbyn had been very silent on this, really frustratingly silent. In the summer I went to the People's Assembly March and sort of more or less directly challenged him to speak up about these Labour councils. And he came along a bit later. John McDonnell saw me say it. But Jeremy Corbyn came along a bit later on and said nothing, and then some of the campaigners tried to challenge him about this, and he just said nothing and scurried away. But because of the vote at conference, he spoke up, put it in his speech. He said it's now Labour policy. In the Assembly, I put a motion in December, and every single party voted for it. We had a unanimous vote in favour of ballots in the Assembly, and that includes all the Tories who voted, and UKIP as well. So kind of you can't get much more cross-party than that. So I think by the end of December the Mayor realised he had no choice, and so we do have now the final estate guidance, which says that residents on estates for demolition must be given a ballot, or there will be, it's a strict condition of funding from the Mayor. So it's basically the same words as we had in our response to the consultation. So I'm taking that as a major victory. But we have work to do, because there's also the, where is it? Oh, I've brought it with me. Anyway, there's also a technical consultation on exactly how this is going to work in practice. And in that it says what estates it will apply to, at what stage in their process, and who will be able to vote. And the one thing about that I think is worrying, because actually some of the bits of it in it are really good. For the ballots themselves, they recommend that the Electoral Reform Services, which is the independent people who do ballots like the Green Party leadership ballot, they should be called in. They say we need a proper independent set of people to do the ballots, and that's really good. We need to respond to the consultation and go, that's really good. But there are bits. It says that private renters can't vote in it unless they've been on the council's housing list for more than a year. And we all know how difficult it is to get on the council's housing list at the moment. So I think that's kind of wrong. And it also says that only estates where more than 150 homes are at demolition can, and I think that's too high. I think you know, if you've got 50 homes, they should get a vote too. The other thing is what stage it applies, and what it says is only after the mayor's funding contract has been signed, if the mayor's funding contract has already been signed, then you don't have to do a ballot. And that's the real question for the 5 estates in Lambeth that are really up for this at the moment, because none of them have planning permission, and in my view the ballot should be the last thing that happens before you go for planning permission, not when you're making funding or, you know, cabinet decisions about the options. It should be right at that end point. And when you're making the cabinet decisions, you should be taking into account the residents' views, and the residents should really be putting together the options themselves. So I put in a mayor's question this month to the mayor, asking him exactly on the date that this came out, exactly give us a list of all the estates where you've actually signed the funding contract. And then, because there's a 3-month consultation period on the technical consultation, this sounds ridiculous, at the end of that we need to know how many were rushed through that process before it properly comes into effect. But I think we're on good ground here, because, you know, we've won the campaign, we've won the moral argument with the mayor. He is now doing estate ballots, and if he tries to get out of a lot of them on a technicality, if he doesn't actually impose that policy on councils where the most people are being the most vocal and are the most upset about not being listened to, then yeah, he really has to expect the full wrath of everybody who responded to the consultation before. So it's very important that we all respond to the consultation, but it's also really important that we get the data that we need about the Lambeth estates, and that we put as much pressure on as possible that he can use, because he has funding powers and he has planning powers, and he said very clearly he's going to use his funding powers, but he needs to be using his planning powers as well for these estates when they come for planning. And the London Plan does say that, and this is the mayor's planning policies, so this will apply to estates and, you know, larger applications that go to him. He has said that people should be following the estate good practice guide. So we have to make sure there aren't loopholes that Lambeth can get through. And if they do try to get through them, we need to be shouting as loudly as possible. And that's what the Greens are for, and that's why you need more Green councillors. The second part of my talk, I want to give you some idea of some of the policies that are in the London Plan, and some things that you could call for at a Lambeth level for your local housing policies in your local elections. And there's an awful lot where the mayor isn't doing enough, I think. This is my draft response. This is my response to the draft London Plan draft. And there's lots of things in here where actually the mayor needs to do a little bit better, and where he needs to be a bit clearer about how this applies. But there's also some good stuff in there. All those tips on that document are things that I've managed to get sort of the mayor to at least give us a bit of a clue and a bit of a hook so that local councils can do things. One of the problems is the definition of affordable housing. So we all know that Boris Johnson and the government want affordable housing to be anything up to 80% of market rate. So that's an awful lot of money in terms of sales. We're talking probably about £500,000 at London level. But also in rents, 80% of market rates, with market rates as they are, is very, very high and not affordable at all. So the mayor has defined a London living rent, which is the rent we'd all like to have, a third of local average wages. So that's not to do with market rates at all, that tracks with wages, and that is about what you can afford if you're a normal person. That though is not being applied by the mayor to all homes as a definition of affordable. And what he said is, I want 50% affordable homes, ideally across all planning applications, and within that I want 30% of them to be social rent, 30% to be London living rent, and the other 40% I'm going to leave that up to the boroughs. So obviously within your local election campaign you could be saying that other 40%, that needs to be London living rent as well. So that's one thing where you can really say what you're going to do. I'm saying the mayor shouldn't leave it up to the boroughs, because there's a clear need for 2/3 of our homes to be social rent. So that should be the policy. And also, you know, they're leaving it 40% up to the boroughs. Boroughs can't stand up to big developers the way that the mayor can. He needs to be setting the rates. There's also a big question, and this is not cleared up. We've had some very long discussions about this in the Housing Committee, about whether or not 50% is gross or net. And I guess so. Imagine, if you will, an estate where you've got, say, 200 homes that exist, and the proposal is to knock down those 200 homes and build, let me get this right, 400 homes. Now, if 50% of those 400 homes are at affordable rates, then your net gain of affordable rates, rents, is 0. So, should it be that 50% of the net gain is what should be affordable? I think so, because otherwise you're incentivising demolition. You have to take all the incentives out of demolition out of these policies. There's other things that are not good enough in terms of demolition in the policies. One is that there's no presumption against demolition in here at all. There's no warnings against it. It's very much trying to judge things on what's there at the end, not what's happening to homes that are already there at the beginning. So that needs to change. But I think councils, because it's not clear, councils can put that in much more firmly and say we want a presumption against demolition. You can also say that you want proper appraisal of schemes. So we all know the concept of embodied carbon, I hope. And it's if you've got a beautiful estate like Central Hill, all the concrete in that estate used a lot of carbon putting it together, and if you knock down that estate and build it again, you're wasting all that carbon, and there's a huge carbon sort of deficit at the beginning of the process. And I've had this in Camden where they've said, oh, but the homes are going to be so ecologically friendly, they're not going to use any carbon, they're going to be really, really green. And you go, but you're starting with this deficit. How many years of operation of those homes before you've got rid of this deficit? And they can't tell you because they don't do proper appraisal, and you should. The other part of appraisal you need is the social impact. And we've all seen the maps of what's happened on the Haygate estate, where the leaseholders have ended up living, the scattering even of the social tenants to far-flung places within Southwark and outside of Southwark as well. And that kind of social cleansing, that has an impact too, and can be measured and should be measured. And the other thing is the rents on replacement homes, and this is where we also need to feed back on the estate regeneration guide as well. Because the Mayor's used about 5 different ways of saying when you replace the homes, the rents should be the same. People on Crescent Hill Gardens do this very well, don't they? They're looking at how something like a 30% rent hike is being proposed for them. Who's from Crescent Hill Gardens? There's the rents that they're promising to charge you are not the same rents as you're paying at the moment if you're a council tenant. They're promising to pay that you'll pay something like social rents, and this is the vagueness that the Mayor suffers from in this guide as well. I'm trying to find the different places where he says it now. I have written it down. Anyway, he does say in various different places, same or similar, or the same kinds of rents. And in one place he does say the same rents. So we need some clarification as to what he means by that. Do you get to move in at the same rent as you are paying, or do you get to pay like the maximum of what possibly could be defined as a social rent for your area? So those are the things to do with estate regeneration and housing. The other things that I think people should be putting into their manifestos when you're talking about making new housing and planning policies is about the process. It's about making sure that when you're making plans for new areas, that the local people are the starting point for that all plans are community-led, the options generation, the goals of the regeneration, the goals of any kind of planning application. Some of the things that are in the London Plan are to define sort of industrial areas as places for regeneration. And there you might have, also big box shopping centres, which I think is a really good policy. So if you've got like a big Tesco's near a town centre, that is up for regeneration there. Those are places that the Mayor wants to see redeveloped because they're sprawl and they're encouraging car travel. So if there's an area like that where you're having new homes planned, even if people are not having their homes demolished, people should be leading that process from the start. And the London Plan itself is quite rude about neighbourhood planning. I don't know if you've got neighbourhood forums set up around here, but if you have, you'll know how hard they work to think really carefully about how new areas should be redeveloped. They also look really closely at small sites, and there's a lot of policies in the London Plan saying councils need to deliver more homes and more developments on smaller sites. And these are things like, you know, bits of car park and depots and things, as well as potentially back gardens, which we will get into at some point. If you want to ask me about back gardens, you're very welcome. But those small sites are the sorts of things where neighbourhood forums look very closely and go, yeah, there's space there and we'd like some new homes. And they should be able to say what kinds of new buildings they want there, what sorts of heights, what sorts of, they call it typology. But that you should really have a say about that. And the Mayor's not brilliant on that at the moment. There are other hooks for good policies that were in my, wherever it is, towards the New London Plan document. One of them is buy to leave. Now you might have seen the Mayor announcing his first dibs policy this week. Yeah, yes, chuckle. It's basically the same policy as what Boris Johnson had, which is a voluntary agreement with some housing providers to market some homes to Londoners before marketing them abroad. I mean, it's the lamest possible interpretation of first dibs you could possibly get. We have waited nearly 2 years. I think Sadiq always knew that first dibs was a slogan that he wouldn't really be able to deliver a proper policy on. But I said, in my response, a policy he could have. And that is something that there is a hook for in the London Plan now. And what they've said is, we will support local authorities in their local plans if they want to try and put in measures to prevent homes from not being used as residences. And that is, so those are clauses you can put in to prevent buy to leave. You can say, you can have planning permission for this, but because this is an area where, and you have to justify it in a smaller area, but because this is an area where we've had a lot of problems with people buying flats off plan and not really living in them, or we've had too many buy to let investments, and we really want local people to be buying these homes, you can put clauses in that say, you know, the least conditions are that if you buy this home, this must be your private residence, your primary residence. And that's something you can do if you can justify it on a local level. And I think for some of the regeneration areas that are being now excessively gentrified around London, that would be a really good policy. Other good things that are in there that you can write in are not housing policies at all, but policies for private public spaces. Following a bit of campaigning, I don't know if some of you might have come out with me marching around in the cold in 2016 around more London, where City Hall is based, where there's a big private public space where it's all patrolled by security guards and there's arbitrary rules on whether or not you can do filming and protests and things like that. The Mayor's actually taken that pretty much to heart and written that he's going to do a public space charter, and that there should be no arbitrary rules, and that the council bylaws should be the kind of thing that rule public spaces. And that's great, but local councils do need to sort of enact that at a local level as well. Camden's just written, again at my suggestion, a supplementary planning guidance that has very good policies in it, so yeah, that's the sort of thing you might steal. What else do we have here? Meanwhile use, so empty shops, empty community buildings, empty sort of council-owned buildings, putting them to use for the community, rather than filling them with property guardians, which is another thing that you should have some good policies on at a local level. Putting them out there so that community groups, like people who run this cafe, can use those spaces in the meantime. And that, again, is a policy that's in here. There's a whole bit about encouraging it in here. But it's basically leaving it up to councils to do, to write up in detail. So there's like, you know, four lines in here in the plan, but you can do that at a local level, and you kind of already can. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that. You don't have to wait for the London Plan. And the other thing is fire safety. Now the Mayor's put in a whole new policy on fire safety, but it doesn't mention transparency, and transparency I think is the key thing. I've managed to get Camden to release all their fire risk assessments for all the council blocks in my ward. I did that through a freedom of information request, and I wrote to, when I was initially refused, I wrote to the Information Commissioner, and she was great. She's kind of new. She's come from Canada, where they really understand freedom of information, because America's had these, well, America and Canada have had these rules for so long. She wrote back straight away and said, yeah, good point. All fire risk assessments should be in the public domain. And she wrote to the council saying, don't wait to be asked to publish these things. And I think you need absolute transparency on fire safety. The Mayor's asked in the London Plan for a fire assessment to be made for every home that gets put into planning. But that's a bit like, that's just like what they promised to do, and you need the actual fire risk assessments of the buildings once they're built. You need the ongoing assessments, you need the building control sign-off, all of that needs to be transparent. That's really important, and policy you should definitely have. Finally, there's community-led housing, which I didn't mention yet. It's not something the Mayor's particularly keen on, and it's not something particularly that you write into planning rules. It's about how you pay for, how you use public land, and about making sure that people who want to build and run their own homes get a chance at being developers themselves. And that again is something that you can write into land policies. You can find some land and promote it as being suitable. And if you've got people trying to set up community land trusts and co-ops in Lambeth, trying to make sure that you promise them land is really good. People will throw around, some councils are at different places on this. And some councils are like, no, we must get the best consideration. We can't sell any assets without getting the best price. But actually, the rules on best consideration are fairly more relaxed than they used to be. You can justify that in grounds other than getting the best price. You can talk about getting the best social value, for example. And there is a bit of a get-out clause in the whole rules about this, in that you can give up to, I think, and I can't remember the number, it's either 2 or 3 million, but you can give a discount of up to £2 million without getting permission of the Secretary of State. So if your bit of land isn't worth £2 million, then effectively you can give it away for nothing without getting someone else's permission. You just have to justify it in terms of your own policy goals and your strategy as a council. And Lewisham have done this. So if anyone thinks that sounds crazy, so the point is there are hooks and there are examples of other councils doing lots of things that you can put together quite a radical programme for. And you really should. You know, these things add up to, even though like there's no one silver bullet that fixes the housing crisis, unless really you're talking about letting councils borrow more to build loads more council homes, because that is viable for councils to do, but the government won't let us do it. So while the government isn't letting us do this, you can still do an awful lot within the current rules, and none of them are a one size fits all or one easy thing. There are lots of different medium-sized things. I won't say little things because none of these things are little, but there's lots of medium-sized things that you can do, and at the end of it, you've really changed the landscape for the private developers. You'd have really made it a different kind of place than one where doing joint ventures with private developers is the only option, as the Harrogate councillors would make out. And it really isn't. Camden got completely scared off doing something similar, and they're pretty content to stick with a policy that isn't the Harrogate Development Vehicle, isn't a massive joint venture. Politically it was very difficult for them to do it, but it just shows that there isn't only one alternative to doing housing, and with all these different ideas you can put together something that I think will be really inspiring for local people, and they'll go, yeah, I see people have different housing needs too, and they'll look at it and they'll think, yes, I can see how I can get the housing that I want from those policies, and yes, aren't they practical? So that's my housing vision and my housing advice. and I'm quite happy. Printer's broken, so I only have it written on scrappy paper, but I'm quite happy to write all that up for people and put it around to local parties throughout London, because it's really important that we put together policies that are practical, and there just is a lot we can do these days, and I think we all should be thinking about doing it and pushing it at every level that we possibly can. I'll do that at City Hall, and I'm doing it in Camden, and you should be doing it too.